Professor John Keane, a great pleasure of mine, because I might say I'm a fan, you know. You deserve this, you know, stardom status. Thank you so much for being
Not
a part.
quite, Ivana, but you know, it's a great thrill and pleasure to be talking to you too.
Thank you, of this project. You wrote a lot about democracy in your life. You've been kind of innovator and a thinker that went out of the boxes. The time we're living in, you started a blog called Enemies of Democracy, if I'm right. So
Yes.
what is the democracy as we knew it? As you called monetary democracy, so post-Second World War democracy, where we accept the voting cycle, establish some monetary institutions to be
Yes.
kind of watchdogs of those governments. What are we experiencing at this moment? What are these threats and who are these enemies of the democracy as we know it in the West?
Well, this is a period in which there is writing on democracy's wall. In my lifetime, I've never seen anything like it. Mm-hmm. Many are speaking of a Zeitenwende, you know, a turning point in history. Some observers liken it to the 1920s and 30s. The disaffection with democracy, the sense that it doesn't work, that parties are unrepresentative, that governments are deciding things without the consent of people. All of these feelings are growing, and this represents, in my view, a very serious threat to monetary democracy. What does this strange phrase mean? It means a type of democracy born in the 1940s in which democracy is nothing less than free and fair elections, but something much more. And the something much more is the reliance on watchdog, barking dog institutions to expose corruption, to bring accountability to corporations, to governments, to non-governmental organizations that are corrupted or abusing power. So when it works well, a monetary democracy has free and fair elections, but it also has this constant daily accountability mechanisms built into it that produce scandals, corruption scandals. So what is at stake? This is the Austrian Air Force. NATO.
No, it's fine.
NATO's overhead. What is at stake is whether this kind of democracy, the most complex in its history, a form of democracy that is global, that sensitizes people to abuses of power, that tries to prevent foolish decisions and corruption, invisible power. This kind of democracy is threatened by a whole variety of trends. Growing gap between rich and poor, the unpopularity of and declining membership of parties, ecological catastrophes, extreme weather events, death of species. And these trends are, we don't know where they're going to end, but young people are caught up in these contradictory trends.
And we are in Vienna, as you've mentioned. It's autumn 2022, so the winter is coming. We are still, Russia is still attacking Ukraine. We have huge inflation, energy prices. So what are the basically trends or this feeling of young people of today? You've mentioned disappointment, you've mentioned also, in a sense, insecure or precarious work they're faced with. We know that we live in a digital environment that basically is uncontrollable, but by usual means in democracy. In a sense, we know what happens with big tech, with influencing, with disinformation. So where do we leave or put the youth of today in this definitions of democracy as we knew them?
Everything depends, say it again, much depends on what we mean by politics. If politics is about elections, parties, parliaments, politicians, governments, then the survey evidence that's accumulating is that in many actually existing monitory democracies, young people are disaffected. They don't join parties, they have limited respect for politicians, they curse governments, and they hate politics.
But that was something that was, always, I don't know, from student movement 68,
yes,
it's kind of youth thing to protest, but what's different now?
It has a history, that's for sure. But if politics has other meanings. If politics means engagement in public life, then we see signs of young people who are involved in climate strikes, who are involved in organizations like Amnesty, Greenpeace, in direct actions like Extinction Rebellion, #MeToo, Black Lives Matter. If politics is about engagement in public life, trying to effect power reversals through public action, through public assembly, helped by online engagement, then there's plenty of young people's involvement. But there's another sense, a third sense of politics. It's the slogan of the 1960s that the personal is political, a great feminist principle, elaborated by Michel Foucault. The idea that there is a politics of everyday life, that who gets what, when, and how in everyday life can be determined by you by changing the way language is used, by thinking differently about bodies and choice, the food we eat, the way we dress. These are political matters in this third sense. And it's this sphere, I think, in which we're witnessing the flourishing, not the exiting from, the flourishing of youth politics. The question is, how does this get translated into public life and into electoral politics? It's one of the great questions that those who worry about young people's disaffection with politics are centrally concerned with. Does this involve lowering the voting age to at least 16 or younger? This is one of the questions. In my own view, in my own work, I've tried to say that we should widen the understanding of politics in actually existing democracies, because seen in this way, youth turnout, where voting is not compulsory, is low. It's often extremely low, but public engagement
is high.
There are signs, and certainly in the politics of everyday life, young people are centrally concerned with the way that, for example, a man speaks to a woman. Mansplaining, as I'm doing now.
Yeah, but it's raining and it rhymes with mansplaining, and I think we're going to hide a little bit here. There is one place in Vienna,
yeah, gladly,
which has a quote of John Lennon talking about protests, and we'll come underneath here, I think, not to finish up. So this is fantastic definition. How much did this affect youth today, in that sense, what you were just talking about? And how will this, digital generation, which is basically, I still remember analog, but, my son, he doesn't remember how the world was without internet or mobile phones or whatever. So the participation changed with this. We saw it, in good ways and in bad ways. And how will they understand the meaning of state of what state is offering to its citizen, which was, elections were part of this model. So how will they understand this with all of these things that you just mentioned?
Well, every historical form of democracy, Ivana, is connected to, bound up with a mode of communications. Classical Greek assembly democracies where adult males gathered in public, the main means of communication was orality, speaking and acting in public. The age of electoral democracy that came next, where elections are central, was the age of the printing press, of newspapers, books, novels, pamphlets. And interestingly, the age of electoral democracy was threatened by the advent of mass communications, broadcasting, radio and television. This age of monitory democracy that we've been talking about is underpinned by digital network communications, in which there are, and this mode of communications has some novel features. It's the first form of communications where text, sound and image are integrated. This information is easily copied. It's very cheap to circulate in almost zero time space settings. And that's a key reason why, despite all of the dark trends, surveillance capitalism, harvesting of digital information, so on, despite those trends, the counter trend is hugely important for understanding how young people are engaged in politics. The politics of everyday life, the politics of public life is unthinkable,
and participatory
undoable,
moment is unthinkable
without tools centered on the cell phone, the smartphone. Without these tools, this kind of politicization of everyday life and the politicization in public settings wouldn't be possible. And it is a struggle for parties and governments, parliaments to catch up with this trend. What we're witnessing is, I think, young people driving what I call digital mutinies. They use tools to report on aggressive behavior, on racism, xenophobia, on misogyny, etc., on environmental despoliation. They report on these, circulate it, and these mutinies against mainstream media, against established governing institutions, these digital mutinies sometimes have big effects. This goes on in China as much as it does, say, in the European Union.
But this enfranchisement, as you call it, also has, it has effects, good and bad effects, in a sense that we saw what happened with the COVID. We saw the anti-vax movement, we saw the protests on the streets. There were a lot of young people, male, female, who were scared or whatever. How do you envisage what will come out of this dimension that we went through? It also has huge effects on the mental health. So how do you see basically this revolts on the street, possible scenarios that we will face?
I think, yes, we saw signs of this during the pestilence, which is not over. And young people who joined the anti-vaxxer movement were, on balance, generally those who feel pissed off, who are angry, who are envious of, them, who have all the wealth and the income. There's a stratum of young people in every actually existing democracy who are carriers of what the French call ressentiment, angry resentment, angry envy of imbalances of power, that the cards are stacked against them. And these disaffected young people do indeed go into environmental politics, and they do indeed support, same-sex marriage.
And they do go on the right wing, also extremism. We saw in Slovakia what happened with this killing of, two
they do.
IQ
They are the Islamophobes.
Yeah.
They are the ones who are attracted to the new populist parties. Who are against the establishment, who are vulnerable to conspiracies, who quite like and are attracted to the bad behavior of populists, those who tell big lies. They know that they're lying, but they're attracted because it gives them a sense of belonging and a sense that actually the system needs to be changed. We're going to see how this unfolds in the months and years to come.
And for the end, I said, okay, it's John Lennon. I have to ask you about education. You're a professor. Your role in, maybe a lot of people don't know, during the Cold War was very important. You were part of these intellectuals that were pursuing, what was the name? Flying universities. So you were flying over the Iron Curtain, gathering intellectuals, young people, giving them a sense in this time. When you compare that drive and sentiment of giving knowledge and opening windows for people then, and education that we have now, where we have easy access to, let's say, information through this. You don't need books if you have, or you do, but if you have it here. So how do we see knowledge, education, and effects on our society at the moment, the changes that we face in that regard?
Well, it's
concerning youth, of course.
Yeah, the life chances, the well-being of young people is heavily dependent, and will become even more heavily dependent on tertiary education. Not only good quality primary and secondary, but tertiary education. And this is a question that affects the future of universities. Universities have an opportunity in this period of cascading crises to become ever more attractive to young people, including those young people who live precariously, who are part of what is called the precariat. Universities have an opportunity to offer places, subsidized places, to encourage them to come. And what happens when universities function well? Well, they're spaces and it's a period of life in a space separate from business, separate from government, a space in which one falls in love, one reads, let's say, Simone de Beauvoir, in which Czeslaw Milosz is discovered, in which there is talk about the future of China, in which matters ecological are debated, in which horizons expand, in which there is a kind of transformation of young people's being, where they become wiser about the world. They may, of course, be attracted to earning, loads of money and having careers as diplomats. University is a space in which universities are a space of liminality, where their being is suspended. They don't know what they will become. That's the beauty of the experience of being at university. They may become great journalists. Great investigative journalists are badly needed in these darkening times.
Just for the end, and I wanted to ask you, it's, life is like rain and sun and coming out and in. What about this underprivileged kids in that regard, because what you've mentioned, we do need ideas, do need spaces to rethink ourselves in these times. But what about, it's again, I think, still the majority of people. We saw what Putin told us, that, you know, the other world is there. So what about youth of the world, youth of underprivileged world, youth from autocratic parts of the world, and youth from, let's say, the West, who is being heavily influenced by what is going on? They say, oh, look at this Putin guy, he's riding a bear. He's strong, I want to be Putin.
I'm too old to summarize young people around the world. I can't speak for them.
I know.
But in matters of kids who are excluded by virtue of wealth and income and political power, excluded from the society, then it is institutions of tertiary education that become super important in and where those institutions, some already are doing it, are trying to invent ways of socially embedding themselves, that is in the society, to include young people who are otherwise disaffected, angry about their shrinking life chances. This is not an easy solution. Education in the history of democracy was always, from the 19th century, considered to be an important tool of enlightenment, of self-creation, of empowerment, and that remains so. Of course, whether it's China or the United States or the European Union, young people have entered university.
Globally.
My life is a manifestation of that. I was the first to go to university in my large family. Young people have entered tertiary education on a very large scale, but that is not a completed process. And whether it's Nigeria or whether it is Thailand or whether it is Vietnam or whether it is, let's say, the member states of the European Union, young people, despite all of those differences, you know, are entitled to exercise the right to enjoy a tertiary education, to widen their horizons, to feel the thrill of mixing with others who are wiser than them, who learn to become different.
And for the end, we were sitting here in Vienna. It was your starting point at various trips to Eastern Bloc during flying university times. We heard David Bowie playing on the radio. We were not in Berlin, but there were some associations. We heard Austrian superstar Falco. When you think about your music from your youth, maybe it's a, I don't know, bomb question. If you don't think of it, it's fine.
Ivana, you're entitled to drop bombs.
What kind of music or a singer or a song would describe our zeitgeist? Not Zeitenwende, but zeitgeist.
Well, my son is quite a prominent musician, and he thinks that my music tastes are, you know, old man's taste. They're like dad's taste.
But it's always good
to go. As a young person, you know, music was everything. It was a generation, really the first generation, where young people described themselves as young and were organized and annoyed at the world, against Vietnam War, against patriarchal rule in family life, and so on. They were for choice, for experimentation with sexuality, drugs, and so on. And rock and roll, and Bob Dylan, and The Who, and, you know, I mean, there were different tastes, but that music was an anchor in the world. It was, I'm not being nostalgic, this continues to be the case. Music is an anchor in the world. It provides an orientation, a sense of directions to life. It's very often more before than today. We'll see whether this trend continues. Filled with ethical rules, you know, for how to live one's life. Well, music has stamped, and it continues to stamp, the bodies, the senses, the mentalities of young people, despite its commercialization. That commercialization of music globally is always subject to the punk principle. And here there is a connection between democracy and music, I would say. I've written and just published, it's coming out in many languages, The Shortest History of Democracy, where I say towards the end, democracy has a punk quality. What does that mean? When the spirit of democracy takes root, it interrupts power relations. It calls into question things that were considered to be natural. You know, that relations of power are fixed, unchangeable. Democracy interrupts, it has a punk quality. Well, music can also do that. Rap did it. Rock and roll certainly did it. That kind of a techno David Bowie type music did it, and it's certainly going to happen again in the future. Music is subject to the punk principle, and so is democracy, I would say.
Professor Keane, thank you so much. And to quote Dylan, you've mentioned him times, they're changing and will be changing.
They will, and it doesn't need a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing, he also says.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Oh my God, it's cold.
Pleasure.
It's getting cold. Oh, thank you.